If you've ever seen the super popular Netflix show Stranger Things, then you're probably familiar with this handsome carnivorous gentleman known in the series as the Demogorgon. Because I'm well past the age of disliking things due to their popularity, I can admit that Stranger Things is one of my favorite shows of all time. Today, I'm going to sculpt everyone's favorite evil flower man. If you're new to my channel, what's up, dudes? I'm Andy, and I'm learning how to sculpt tabletop RPG and D&D scale miniatures from scratch by hand. I've also designed a bunch of original board games, and I hope to eventually create master molds for my game prototypes, and or contribute to other upcoming games if I can ever someday get good enough at sculpting. In the short term, I'd really like to be able to make some custom miniatures for friends like D&D characters and stuff like that, that I can put on the table and they won't look totally out of place or wacky compared to other classic D&D miniatures. So here we are starting with the armature. I go through it pretty quick here, but if anyone wants a slow version, just check out the first video that I posted on here, which basically breaks it down step by step. But essentially what I'm doing here is I'm making a lot of U shapes with the wire and then just twisting them around. So I start with like making the spine, kind of like the head, and then make the spine and the hips and the legs, and then I just wrap another U shape around to make the arms, and then more and more U shapes sequentially to build up the form until you kind of get what you want. I gave him these goofy little hand loops to kind of provide a wrapping point for the other fingers that I'm going to add on later, and I wanted to build wires into the fingers for extra support, just because spread out fingers tend to be the most fragile areas of miniatures. At this stage, since this guy is spindly and lanky, the extra texture provided by the wrapped wire is going to be the best thing to make sculpting a lot easier. Since I'm trying to create the Demogorgon on a specific scale, I periodically compare it to the minis that I have that are quote-unquote humans or humanoid, relatively to compare it to the size that they are. After I was pretty happy with the armature, it's sculpting time. And this felt like the right time for me to try out Greenstuff. I guess because of the price of this product and the fact that lots of actual professionals utilize it, I kind of associated Greenstuff with requiring a higher level of skill or talent to use compared to like polymer clay. And polymer clay is more accessible, you can buy it in more stores, so I just assumed that that would be a better starting point. And as it turned out, for me it was exactly the opposite. I always had trouble adhering polymer clay to armatures, even with like solid base layer or with aluminum foil or glue or whatever I put on the base. It didn't matter. It was still kind of slipping off a lot of the time, and it just would come out, like arms and legs would be really brittle and they'd crack off or crumble, and you had to be really gentle with them if they're small, finely detailed pieces. However, by comparison, sculpting with Greenstuff felt like sculpting on easy mode for me, and that's not meant to be offensive to anyone who's like a professional sculptor. I just meant that I think that they use the medium for a reason. It's well suited for creating miniatures based on the pros and cons of it. I think the only really drawback I found to it was that you have a specific working time, but for me, with my workflow, that kind of was a good thing because it pushed me to actually finish the project in kind of one sitting. Not that you have to, I mean you could do it layer by layer, but I wanted to do it all at once and end up spending a few hours, and that was a lot better than if I make one with polymer clay and like just let it sit there for a few months because I get busy or whatever. But the timeline of how it worked for me was I stuck on the Greenstuff and it started off more sticky and soft, and then it adhered and it was kind of gummy, and then as it started to dry I was building out and it was firmer, which made it easier to do that the more fine details. So in the end the dry time made the workflow much more convenient and smooth. Greenstuff is definitely popular for a reason. It sticks onto the armature super easily, but it isn't so soft that it can't hold its shape. So you can kind of stick it on, smooth it out, and basically all I did was just tear pieces and kind of press them into the armature and then just smooth it out with like a little bit of water on my silicone like sculpting tool, and that worked very well. With the proper tools, this is really pretty easy and super fun. I'll link everything I used in the description, you know, the YouTuber thing. What's kind of funny too is I actually had several friends and acquaintances who knew that I played D&D but had never really talked about wanting to play it themselves, approach me and be like, dude, I just watched Stranger Things. Is the game in that show the same game that you're always like talking about playing? Oh, yo, I'd be down for that. Well, why don't you just explain it? Like, why didn't you just say it was like that? It's like, alright, that's kind of awesome though. All those random conversations that I had were a direct result of people watching the show and really enjoying it. So I think that that's really kind of cool. I feel like Stranger Things was the best PR that D&D ever got since the original Lord of the Rings film series hit theaters. And yeah, I'm aware that this is primarily a cat channel with a light hint of crafting, but that's where we are. So the Demogorgon's looking pretty decent at this point. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just layer some slightly diluted tacky glue onto the fingers to just smooth out the twists that I made. And this is just the easiest way to do it. If I try to get in there with clay, I don't know, I feel like I would bump around and I'd probably mess it all up. But anyway, this seems to be the easiest way to bulk up the fingers very conveniently and keep them pretty smooth. It took a bit of finagling, but in the end, what was traditionally the most fragile part of a mini, like the spread out fingers, it instead is the most durable and flexible part, which I think is a huge plus. Then to get those super long, creepy, sinuous fingers, I had the idea to use hot glue. And I think that was actually a pretty clever idea, just to pat myself on the back some more. I've never seen this done before, and I don't know why I haven't, because it's just a really quick and easy way to get really smooth but tapered, elongated fingertips. And they are going to easily adhere to the armature and the tacky glue because glue is an adhesive. So it made a lot of sense. At this stage, it looks a bit like he's that Emperor Palpatine guy shooting lightning from his hands, the Force lightning. But I think once it's primed, you're not even going to be able to tell that it's two different forms of media. So I think it's going to be pretty cool. Oh yeah, and I can't stress enough how vital it is to make these little feet loop things into the armature.
Oh, I can't believe you've done this.
I've lost a lot of good feet and legs to pliers due to forgetting this step. But if you have it there, you can use that as a stopper and pull it out with ease. Immediately with the primer on, I was excited to see that this angry flower dude was actually going to look somewhat imposing and true to the concept art of the show. This next phase of the project was really relaxed because overall the paint job is a simple one. If Wizards of the Coast were to mass produce a mini like this, I'm sure it would be one of their easiest paint jobs. Essentially there's only two main colors, which is the red in the mouth area or the flower petals, and just the skin tone. I worked in layers of partially wet blended thinned down base coats because I wasn't exactly sure what the right color was going to be, especially because if you look up pictures or you watch the show, he's kind of described as being white, and I think in reality when you see him, like, he looks almost like gray and he's all like shadowy, but I think that's mostly because he's in dark areas, so it's kind of hard to say if he's fleshy or gray or like what, but there's a lot of interpretation and creative license that can be done here. So here I had heard that dish soap can be used as like a cheap DIY flow aid for washes, and I didn't consider that in a batch this small, one drop of dish soap is a lot, and it can be way too much soap. In what I would call a somewhat happy mistake, I realized that a wash that's too soapy will literally wash off previous layers of paint. This meant that the previous white layer and pinkish layer and gray tan layers blended even more into like this blotchy, inconsistent form of layer that was a lot more organic looking, and it's very subtle, but I think it's kind of cool. Definitely another lesson learned either way. But essentially I put down several different base coats that sort of were blended together because I didn't let them dry in between, and I kind of came up with what I had here. And then I just went back and forth with white dry brushing to get like highlights, and then a maroon and black wash until I got it looking halfway decent. While that's going on, I wanted to talk about how cool I think it is that a show like this became so popular in the first place. This is the first time I've ever seen a show so well liked have so many references to Dungeons and Dragons. Like, that's awesome. I would even venture to guess that the show coming out has maybe even been correlated to an increase in sales and playing of Dungeons & Dragons, at least across the US. And as someone who really loves D&D and tabletop RPGs, I felt like the show went a long way towards demystifying them for people who never even considered getting involved or playing them, and it made these kinds of games so much more accessible to quote-unquote lay people or people that aren't super nerdy. So here I am using a little nail, and I've been known to use like mechanical pencil lead and sewing needles and stuff like that, and this phase of the project kind of made me think of those mean piranha plants from the Mario games. Good times. I think I should just shell out the $4 or whatever it is at the craft store and get one really fine tip paintbrush. Here's my box of 100 bases, aka counting chips on Amazon. It's just a much cheaper way to buy them if you look for counting chips as opposed to D&D 28mm plastic bases. Because people know like those are adults buying those things, they probably have more money and they're willing to shell out. I decided to try to make the buyer's living room from season 1 because I thought it would kind of make a cool diorama or like a decorative background to stage the Demogorgon mini that I was making. And I started making the stage with the wallpaper, which they had like this flowery pattern wallpaper. I couldn't find anything like that, and I might have been able to print it out, but then I would have had to like color it in by hand. So I decided to just coffee stain a piece of paper and then stamp this little stamp I found onto just a few repeating times, which it's not like exactly the right scale, but I think it looks pretty darn close. When it comes to building terrain, the part that I don't really enjoy is measuring and cutting like foam core and then attaching it all to each other and then building that whole foundation that you're ultimately just going to cover up with other things anyway. I feel like you can easily just subvert that whole step by just using some kind of box or carton that's already made, and the bonus is that you're cutting down on time, you're recycling, you're saving materials, and arguably you're boosting the durability, because if it's like a folded piece of cardboard versus having to glue two pieces of foam core together, I don't know, at least in my experience, I feel like the formed box like stays together better because it's designed for durability essentially. It's designed to be shipped around. So after a quick clear coat for the Demogorgon and a prime for the house, I moved on to making the wood tile floor for the living room. This ended up taking a lot of coffee stir stick clippings, but I ended up loving making them, man. It was almost like doing a puzzle, but every piece is compatible with every other piece, so it's like a tessellation or something. I don't know, it was fun. I had a good time. So the theme of this project kind of ended up being coffee stir sticks. I used so many of them. I'm definitely someone who prefers using actual wood to represent wood rather than using foam made to look like wood. And I know like arguably carved foam looks better, or like it can look more convincing when it's painted, but I don't know, it's maybe it's tedious to use the little wood stir sticks, but I like the feel of the wood, and I like that when like you touch the piece it feels like what you'd assume it would feel like. I don't know. Currently I'm living without roommates for the first time, and I feel like choice buyers a lot of the time when anyone comes over unexpectedly or they visit, because I always have some random like hard to explain project going on throughout the whole place, and there's like a giant fort for my cats or something made out of blankets. People just come in with this look of bewilderment and like, what the hell happened here? Like that Ant-Man meme. I think my favorite character other than the Demogorgon is Hopper. And this is partly due to the fact that when my parents watched the show and they talked to me about it, my mom always called Hopper Hooper. And I just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. I laughed so hard the first time, and I think that she didn't even realize she was saying it wrong, so she just kept calling him Hooper. And I was like, that's amazing. I made a couple unintentional stains on the wallpaper while I was trying to dark wash the wood, but honestly I feel like, considering the amount of chain smoking that went on in that room, I would argue that it's still somewhat on brand. I can't even imagine how hard it must have been for someone who was trying to quit smoking and they put on Stranger Things. Like, Jesus Christ. One of my favorite parts of the project was making some furniture with the air dry clay. It just felt like low stakes. It's fun. I absolutely love the fact that you can wet the clay to the point of like actually diluting the clay into like a liquid, and it just makes it becomes so like flexible what you can do with it, and I feel like it's just so much easier to make a smooth surface with air dry clay than it is with like any other material. I would say I definitely nailed this doorknob. No, I'm just kidding. Dude, that is a little nail. I just put a little tiny nail and it looked perfect. I'm so pumped about that. It's an actual metal doorknob that looks like it's on scale. I don't know, that's awesome. However, the biggest failure to this project was definitely the lighting situation. I wasn't willing to try to figure out how to individually wire LEDs through the back wall to align them with the letters painted on the wall. So the only alternative I could really come up with was using these little fairy lights, and presumably they work well as scale Christmas lights, but they're really big and they're really spaced out. So they end up being way out of scale and too far spaced apart to really look like convincing Christmas lights. Ended up deciding to twist together 2 strands and then like bunch them up a little bit so that I could make the lights closer together. But that ended up making the wire look really thick in some spots and just didn't really look great. I think you can still kind of tell what I was going for. I think if I did it again, what I would have done to make it look a lot more aesthetic is just use like a piece of thread and little tiny beads painted to imply Christmas lights rather than try to make an actual light fixture. Maybe that would have been lame. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this build and definitely super pumped about how the Demogorgon came out. Like, definitely my best mini yet, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact that he's a bigger guy, so it's easier to make finer details on a larger miniature, versus like if I tried to make a halfling right now, like I can't even imagine how like dorky that thing would look. If you had fun watching the Demogorgon come to life here, definitely subscribe so you can stay tuned and see what I end up making next. One thing I wanted to mention for anyone who likes painting miniatures and has a 3D printer but doesn't want to worry about sculpting, there's definitely a bunch of really pretty good sculpts of the Demogorgon on Thingiverse for free. So I'm going to find like 3 or 4 of my favorite ones on there and just put those links in the description. So if someone wants to paint their Demogorgon, I feel like he's a pretty cool guy to try to paint because like he's a simple paint job, but you can take a lot of creative license and stuff. So definitely a good experimental piece to learn with. Thanks for checking out the video, guys.
Yep. Crap, no!